Well, folks, I think we'll maybe make a start as say a few more folk come in. We did have to change the time due to a few dairy clashes this evening, but hopefully that will not be a major issue for lots of people. But we are recording this, so that's for your information at this stage and also to help people watch it back. So look, folks, I'm Elizabeth McGowan. I'm a director in AFBI, and you're very, very welcome to this, the third webinar in a three-part webinar series where we're really keen to focus on grass. Grass is one of Northern Ireland's best assets, and we're very focused in AFBI to try and maximise the production and utilisation and provide farmers with tools to do that. So this evening, I'm really pleased to have Paul Cotney, one of our senior agronomists from AFBI, presenting for us. And very much complementing that is Andrew Wright, a dairy farmer from Omagh and also the UFU's Vice Chair of Agri-Environment Committee. So I think you've got two great presentations ahead of us. And then at the end, when Andrew and Paul present, Jason Rankin, Agri-Search Strategy Manager, and Paul Turney, a beef farmer from the Downpatrick area and a grass check farmer, will also give us their insights as to how they maximise grass production and utilisation, especially in the year ahead of us, where we've just had a day of 4 seasons here in Northern Ireland, very challenging as usual. But how the practical experience is working through to try and manage those high production costs, especially fertiliser. So, as I said, the purpose of this evening's webinar is very much to complement the first 2 webinars, where we looked at different grass growth patterns and way to manage swards throughout the season. Last week, we looked at soil and soil health and some results from the soil scheme. But this week, it is about where to invest to optimise grassland productivity. So folks, there's question and answer boxes there. Please feel free to use them. We'll take a few questions after Paul presents and then a few questions after Andrew's video and then into a panel discussion with Jason and Paul. So don't be afraid to get those questions in there. But look, with no further ado, I think we'll invite Paul to start presenting, please. As I say, Paul is a senior agronomist based over at Crossing very much working in the grassland space. So Paul, if you're okay to present.
Yep, that's okay. Perfect.
Thank you.
So hopefully you can see my screen there now.
Yeah. Got you. Good.
Okay, perfect. So today my talk is on investing in grasslands to optimize productivity. And what I'll be covering is soil pH, the correct species in swards, and also then the right rate of nitrogen, considering the different in prices there, given that volatility which we're going through at the minute. So I'm going to just jump straight into the key take-home messages from this talk, and that is to maintain nitrogen rates for responsive fields, as in many cases, reducing nitrogen rate does not always reduce cost of production. To reduce long-term cost of production, should aim to try and improve soil pHs, measure field performance to optimize the management of these fields, and also implement and maintain a reseeding policy. So what are the key pillars then for efficient and profitable sward production? And these are ensuring that there's a correct grass species and frequency of reseeding. Over the last 40 years across the region, reseeding practices have dropped, meaning that swards are getting older, and that limits their potential productivity. Likewise with soil pH, lime usage has dropped over the last 40 years, and that limits productivity again. And lastly, having the correct nutrient supply from nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium and sulfur. But for this talk, I'm going to be concentrating on nitrogen supply. So having the correct grass species and frequency of reseeding is critical. Some of the uncompetitive or weed grasses, such as rough-stalked meadowgrass and Yorkshire fog, only have a production capacity of 70 to 80% compared to that of perennial ryegrass. So this limits yield, and in many cases as well, the quality and voluntary intake of these grasses is lower, and they have a lower response to nitrogen. Some of the key species then, which you want in swards, are some of these the following. And what this is is data which I've pulled out over the last 5 years from Grassland Insights, where we test the different varieties of these species. So what I've plotted then is cumulative yield over a growing season. And what you can see then is the different species, such as Timothy, have a lower production potential compared to, say, that of Italian ryegrass. But Timothy itself is a very, very good grass for cold, wet soils and offers persistency there and a competitive edge, whereas Italian ryegrass, yes, you get the yields from it, but is more suited to light, early land, where you can utilize that good early growth and late autumn growth as well. The cornerstone of most sward production is perennial ryegrass, and they are usually broken up or categorized into their heading date. So what we have is intermediate and late, and typically across the Creevy, the intermediates are cut between the 13th to the 16th of May, and the lates 20th to 24th. And having that and knowing the heading date of some of the varieties and species and grassland mixes is important, so you can tailor it to your farm if you know you're on, say, wetter soils or struggle to get in, and make sure to get grass cut to keep that quality up. So it's about complementing the two. Just look at the frequency of reseeding and the drop-off in potential of swards with time. What I've pulled out here is the 28-year mean yield of perennial ryegrass in their first year of production, which is 17.1 tonne per hectare. But by year 3, that drops by 2.6 tonne to the hectare. So that's just showing that drop off. So choosing the right grasses for your farm, and my key message is going to be here: be fussy with what you're trying to include and try to understand what is in the different mixes. Understand what you want from your mixes. Is it grazing, is it silage, or is it a mix of both? You understand your fields better, so that's why you want to make sure you're targeting the right species for your management and for your conditions. Again, perennial ryegrass is the most versatile, combining quality and yield and persistency, whereas hybrid ryegrass and Italian ryegrass give that growth and yield, but lack in terms of their persistency, meaning they need reseeded more frequently. Whereas Timothy, with a lower production potential, is much better in colder, wetter soils and will perform and persist better than some of these other ones. So where to get some information then, if you want to compare different grass mixtures from suppliers, is looking up recommended grass and clover lists. If you're looking through this and recognise some of the townland names, these are varieties which have been developed by AFBI for Northern Ireland. So what are the key traits you want to look for? And that includes heading date. As I say, it's important to know your conditions, your management style, to try and tailor your perennial ryegrass heading date to that to ensure you're going to optimise the quality of forage. Yield. Ground cover is also important. The ploidy, so that's diploid versus tetraploids. Tetraploids often offer better growth and quality, however lack in persistence compared to diploids. Digestibility value is also important, as is overall persistence. So again, look what is in the bag of grass seed and be fussy, because if you are reseeding, the difference in cost between different mixtures doesn't vary that much. And if your swards are going to be, potentially 10 years, it's important to get these things right. In terms of soil pH then, obviously critical again, and this was presented last week, which was the emerging results from the Soil Nutrient Health Scheme. And it shows a regional pH across Northern Ireland in terms of the trends. So just to reiterate the correct and optimum pH then for different soil types. For mineral soils, it's 6 to 6.5. At that upper end of 6.5 if you want to try and encourage and maximize clover growth. And for peaty soils, it's 5.3 to 5.8. And the benefits from having the correct soil pH means you get the best response from your fertilizer, improving nutrient use efficiency, and soil P availability, meaning you need less. It reduces gaseous emissions of nitrogen, can improve soil structure, allowing for better rooting and overall grass persistency, and improving clover growth. It's estimated for every pound spent on lime returns 7 pounds, which is an incredible return on investment. Thankfully, technology is moving on as well, with boom spreaders now becoming a bit more available across the country, which are great to increase the accuracy of these applications, but also to increase those potential windows for applications of lime, because wind is a key problem for applying lime, especially if some fields are close to houses. So correct nitrogen supply is obviously critical to maximize performance, and it varies on a multitude of factors such as soil type, soil fertility, rainfall, temperature, previous management, species in the composition in the grassland, soil pH, altitude, and field orientation. So there's a lot of factors. But what we get is this graph, which is produced by the RB209. And what it shows is at different nitrogen application rates, the yields dependent on these grass growth classes. So this is a very good grass growth class, average and per, or I'm going to call these very good grass growth potential, average potential and per. So what this graph shows is that as nitrogen rate increases, so does the yield. And as nitrogen rate increases to these higher points, the rate of increase of yield starts to drop, and you don't get the same return from those higher rates of nitrogen. Consequently, in Northern Ireland, the majority of fields fall into this region in terms of very good grass growth potential to average grass growth potential. But as a farm, you may know some of your fields which are needing reseeded due to low yield potential may be performing down here, but you'll have a range. If you have 10 fields, they'll be performing in a range around this here. How do you assess the response on your farm, your yield responses? Well, you can do these things such as looking at species composition when walking across grassland. So if you're on a walk, just even pluck a handful of grass, and usually if the grasses come out with the roots on it, these can be the undesirable species. Perennial ryegrass will have a purpling of the stem and is very identifiable by that. Using plate meters was a very good way to assess productivity over time, and uploading this to AgriNet can help with assessment of that data. And measure against the reseed in any way you can in terms of visually, count the number of bales coming off it, the number of trailers, even looking at the bounce back of swards after they're cutting as well, to try and help estimate and get in your head how your different fields potentially respond in terms of their yield potential. So how does both nitrogen rate and nitrogen price influence cost of production of silage? Not including the cost of nitrogen for a 3-cut system, these costs are going to be just shy of £1,000 per hectare. Every farm will differ, so it will, but again, this is without the cost of nitrogen. And what we're going to look at then is different nitrogen prices. So can £350 per tonne, £450 and £650 per tonne. And what we're going to look at is different scenarios. And these are farms with sufficient silage area for producing sufficient quantities of silage, and also then looking at farms who do not have a sufficient area for silage and require buying additional forage. And this could be due to having extra stock about the place due to being closed to TB. And we're just going to go through this then. So this is scenario 1, which is farms with sufficient area for silage. And what I will say in terms of when I present the graphs here is that individual fields will vary, and these are estimates created from historic data. So what we have here is a graph showing the cost of production on the left-hand side and the rate of nitrogen. So and it's plotted then for these 3 lines, which represent nitrogen at £350 per tonne, or a can at 350, 450 and £650 per tonne. So what this graph shows is that as nitrogen rate increases, your cost of production reduces to a point. And this varies at the different prices of nitrogen. So what this X marks here is the economic optimum rate of nitrogen for the different prices. As you can see, if it is under or below or over by small amount, it doesn't have that big an influence as well. So this is plotted for a very good grass growth potential. Whereas if we look at a sward or a field, so what I'm trying to show here is nitrogen prices influence cost of production and optimal rate of nitrogen. But if we look at an average grass growth potential, sward, this has a different cost of production due to that lower yield. And again, the economic optimum rate is lower because of that lower yield potential. But what this also shows is that sward production potential has a bigger influence in cost of production than the cost of nitrogen in itself. And that's important. So the data here I've been showing in this graph is from Hillsborough and also the average growth grass growth potential class. And what I want to show here is some of the data from multi-sites across Northern Ireland. And what it shows is that it falls within a range for the different nitrogen prices. So for a can at £350 per tonne, the appropriate rate is between 260 to 220, 450, 210 to 200, and can at 650 is 160 to 170. However, for swards or areas which have average grass growth potential, the appropriate nitrogen rate or economic nitrogen rate is much, much lower. We can also use this graph to estimate the payback of reseeding as well. So what you can see here is the difference in the cost of production between can at 350 pounds per tonne is between 20 to 25 pounds. So say if this was two fields, one with the average grass growth potential, and by reseeding it and addressing problems, say, such as low pH, low soil fertility, and getting those good grass species into it could increase yield potential by 2 tonne per hectare. The payback of that would be over across 10 tonnes, reducing the cost of production by 20 to 25 pound per tonne is worth £200 per hectare. The yield increase of 2 tonnes per hectare, just value that at £100 per tonne of dry matter, is worth another 200. Returning then for the total of that is £400 per annum. So if you take a reseeding cost around £1,000 per hectare, means it's a payback of 2.5 to 3 years, which is incredible. So the key takeaway from that, this slide is trying to improve those fields where yield is limited is a key influence in reducing cost of production per tonne of dry matter. So scenario 2 then, and these are farms with insufficient silage area and buying additional forage. And what this adds on to the previous graph then is how with increasing nitrogen rate or decreasing nitrogen rate reduces the yield. In this scenario, that farm would be buying that back and looking at the effect on total cost production. So let's assume this farmer is purchasing silage at £35 per tonne at 27% dry matter. And what this graph shows is for a very good grass growth potential. And again, gives rate of nitrogen across the x-axis and cost of production per tonne in the y-axis. So it shows a cost for can at £650 per tonne and can at 450. So at a rate of 0, why the cost of production is so high is because on this scenario, that farm would be buying back an extra 6.5 tonnes per hectare of dry matter due to that lost yield and that lack of dilution of fixed costs on the yield produced, which is why cost production continues to fall with increasing nitrogen rate, assuming they're having to buy back this extra forage. Put this into perspective, barley at £200 a tonne is equivalent to £235 per tonne of dry matter. And the key takeaway message here is reducing rate of N can actually increase cost of production. However, when we add on the average grass growth potential, so those fields or swards, they do have a lower N rate requirement for optimum nitrogen rate or economic rate. And again, just to pull out the data which we have available. So what I presented here is the Hillsborough data and also the average grass growth class. And again, for that very good grass growth potential, that is between a range. So it is, and somewhere in between that. But it shows the impact of the different prices and Sward potential. So nitrogen fertilizer rate not only affects yield, but it also affects crude protein of silage as well, as then is required to optimize grass protein levels. This graph here shows how increasing rate of nitrogen increases plant tissue N percentage. So plant tissue N percentage is related to crude protein. So if you times it by 6.25 is a value of crude protein. And what I'm trying to show here is at this rate here, at this blue line, plant tissue N is far too high and can risk silage fermentation quality. But to optimize it and optimize crude protein is between this, which is 14 to 15% crude protein silage, is between 2.24 to 2.4% plant tissue N. And consequently, that optimum nitrogen rate is above 250 kilograms of nitrogen. So insufficient nitrogen reduces grass protein levels and can mean then you could be buying back concentrates to try and supplement that. So how do we manage nitrogen then if we do want to try and make any type of reductions in a system? Well, again, classify those fields. Why apply more nitrogen to those fields or the same amount of nitrogen to those fields which aren't responding? Either reduce the level or apply that nitrogen to the ones which are responding. Make sure you're accounting for all nitrogen coming from slurry. For example, is there fields in your system which have received an autumn application of slurry? For example, if 2,000 gallons of cattle slurry was applied per acre, this is a carryover of 15 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Make sure to account for increased N availability from lessee technology. It's usually about 5%, 5 to 10% increase in nitrogen availability. Take account of soil nitrogen supply. So fields which have received above 250 kilograms of nitrogen in the previous year can have their current year nitrogen usage reduced by about 30 kilograms per hectare, which is considerable. And consider using early season urea applications because these are generally 20 to 30% cheaper. In addition, they help ensure that and protect against nitrogen loss because if you were to apply calcium ammonium nitrate, it increases soil nitrate levels very, very quickly and is vulnerable to leaching, whereas with urea, it slowly breaks down to ammonium and is not vulnerable to leaching, which is particularly important in this season, which we're going through. Other nitrogen management strategies is N supply from clover, which was covered in the first talk from David Patterson. Clover can supply a considerable amount of nitrogen. So a 20 to 30% cover of clover can supply up to 180 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Consider overseeding to try and increase the amount of clover and competitive grasses in your swards. And I'd say here, make sure to pay attention to varieties. Make sure to be using some of the tetraploid grasses because they offer that improved competitiveness. Make sure to use large leaf clovers as well to help and compete in that pre-existing sward. So again, just to go through the take-home messages. Maintain nitrogen rates for responsive fields. What we saw there in terms of economic nitrogen rates were showing that not always reducing was decreasing cost of production. Strive to improve long-term soil pH and measure performance to manage your fields individually and appropriately, and implement and maintain a reseeding policy. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully there's a few questions there.
Thanks, Paul. There's no questions yet, so everybody's very shy, or you've bamboozled them. So folks, try and get those questions in. But we'll maybe just jump straight on to Andrew there for Paul. I'm afraid you did take a wee bit longer than I expected, so we'll go straight to Andrew's video, because I think there's a good bit of complimentary stuff. So Andrew, really pleased you took the time yesterday to pre-record to make sure that we heard your story. I think, folks, it's fair to say Andrew and I, we don't agree on everything, but what we do agree on is the importance of grass and the importance of soil nutrients to support grass production and maximise milk from grass. And I have to say, Andrew really does focus significantly on that. And I think Andrew's video that he's going to show us just gives us an insight as to the amount of effort that Andrew does put into trying to optimise his soil status to maximise milk from grass. So while we're getting the video up, any 2 pence worth, Andrew, you want to just say initially?
It's just going to be weird watching myself in a video.
Get ready, here it comes.
Yeah.
So thanks, Andrew, in advance for doing this. Yes, over to the video. Hopefully it will come.
Hello everyone, my name is Andrew Wright and I'm going to be doing something a little bit different in this video. I am going to be talking in one continuous unedited stream, something which I am actually remarkably bad at, but I'm not going to aim for perfection, I'm just going to get it done. And that is the core message I want to get across today. If you're looking at your nutrient management and it's all a bit overwhelming, don't aim for perfection, just take small steps in the right direction. And even if you get stuff wrong and you stumble, it's about the intent as to where you want to get to, which matters. So we're going to start this video off by talking a little bit about our soils. How do we take the theory, the optimum of what your soil should be, and actually get close to achieving that on a farm? And when it comes to pH, for example, what I do here is I take one block of land every year, one out farm, I set that aside and I try and get the entire block limed, preferably in the springtime before you have heavy covers of grass, before you have cattle out, before you have excuses as to why you might leave a field out. I done this 2 years ago. I didn't get it done last year because of the wet spring, and in reality I'm probably not going to get it done this year either because of the wet spring. But that is the plan. That is how I'm trying to tackle them stubbornly low pH fields, which in reality, I'm never going to get reseeded. Next thing I want to talk about is your P and K indexes. Now, I on this farm target 3s. Some people say 3 is too high for P, but certainly for K, 3 is a really nice index to target. However, putting the theory into practice again, it is very, very hard to get to index 3 on a dairy farm. Even though I have quite a lot of slurry every year, even though all of my slurry goes on to my silage fields, I am still having to buy supplementary K to maintain my indexes. How I do that? Well, I buy a product called muriate of potash, which is 0060. So it's a really, really high K product. It's the reason why I use 2 fertilizer sowers at the same time, but it has been really, really successful at building them K indexes up. And the advantage of having high K indexes of target 3 is just that you're more resilient. If you miss a slurry application because of a really wet spring, for example, like this year, your grass will still be able to get it from the soil. It will still grow. Next thing we're going to talk about is what types of fertilizer I use to save money. And wherever possible, I will try and use straight urea. It is the cheapest per kilogram of nitrogen. However, again, taking the theory and putting it into practice, if you are going to use urea, it is really important you apply it in the correct weather conditions. So just before some nice rainfall like we currently have is ideal. And you also need to pay attention to the wind because urea is such a light granule, it will be more affected than your can type products. When it comes to applying sulfur, I am a really big fan of a product called polysulfate. It is actually mined here in the UK, so hopefully the price of that this year will be a little bit less affected than the stuff coming from the Middle East. And again, I apply it through the front sower at the same time as I'm applying my nitrogen out the back. However, you don't have to do that. This is a bit of a ridiculous setup. I think we all acknowledge that. You can just apply polysulfate once. It will provide all of your sulfur for the year and allow you just to get on with applying normal straight nitrogen the rest of the year. I had to clear my throat, so I'm obviously going to have to edit this a little bit. So we've talked a bit about nitrogen, we've talked a bit about sulfur. How do I now apply my P and my Ks? Well, it's the same kind of thing. I prefer to buy a straight product like diammonium phosphate or muriate of potash. And the really nice thing about using straights is that you can then exactly match crop demand. So you're not just balancing for one compound and accepting some waste or undersupply on the other two, you're meeting the requirement exactly. And when it comes to P, K and sulfur, you can generally apply all in one go at one application to do you for a year. So there is extra work with it, you will have to go out more often, but the savings definitely pay for it, especially in a year like this. So just to recap, my preferred source of nitrogen is urea. However, the weather conditions have to be correct. If I can't get the weather conditions for urea, I will always have a canned product on standby, because if you apply urea in incorrect conditions, you don't get the rain to wash it in, you will lose quite a significant amount of nitrogen. When it comes to my P, I need quite little of it, but there is a few fields, index 1s, which are just really hard to get slurry on, really stubborn to get the P index up, and I will go on with a straight product such as diammonium phosphate on them few fields. In general, it might be about a ton a year. It really is not a lot of that product. Then we move on to K, and I use a lot of muriate of potash. Every year, it's somewhere between 6 to 10 tonne, and that is just to maintain my K indexes at index 3. And finally, sulfur. Most of my sulfur is coming from polysulfate, again applied once per year. It is 60% SO3, so it's about an application of, I think, 75 kilograms, provides enough, 75 kilograms per hectare that is, provides enough sulfur to do most of my fields throughout the year. And the final thing we need to talk about is the application rate and the ridiculous price of fertilizer at the minute, and does that make a difference to what I will do? And when it comes to application rates, we do use quite a lot of nitrogen on this farm. We are a very heavily stocked farm, we have a limited land base, and we are trying to maximize the grass we can produce of that. And generally, despite the price of fertilizer, that application rate is not going to significantly change. At first cut, we'll put on 120 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. That's a lot of jargon and numbers, but my point is, this year I am probably going to put on the same 120 kilograms of nitrogen. There is always going to be a return on investment. No, let me rephrase that. Even at the current price of fertilizer, there is a return on investment from applying the optimum rates to grow your grass to avoid having to pay for stuff like expensive concentrates. And the opportunity for savings for farmers is really from that balancing of N, P, K and S. If you're applying your normal rate of N, but your soil is deficient in P or K, or you haven't applied any sulfur this year, and with all of the rainfall over winter, it's all leached out, you're not maximizing what you're already applying. So if you want to be more efficient this year with your fertilizer, I would highly recommend you try and focus on the balance of the key nutrients to your soil indexes, and not try and arbitrarily cut back on nitrogen, which ultimately is going to grow low grass, is ultimately going to grow less grass, and is going to mean that you end up worse off. And the final practical piece of advice I want to use to finish this video off is a warning against the products which claim to be miracle products, which always seem to rear their head whenever fertilizer prices head up. The general rule is bacterial products are not going to be able to influence soil bacteria. Applying a bacterial product through a sprayer onto your leaf has zero chance of influencing your soil bacteria. If you buy a meter cubed of water with a bit of urea in it, it is not going to grow 6 times the amount of grass that the granular urea at the same rate applied is going to grow. Just use your common sense, understand that the reality is the traditional artificial fertilizer is still the most cost-effective way to get nutrients into your soil to actually grow your grass. Hopefully the message here has been clear. Don't aim for perfection. Bite off small chunks and head in the right direction. Don't cut back on nitrogen. Instead, focus on balancing your N, P, K and S levels. If you have any questions, I'll answer them in the Q&A.
There we are. Andrew, that wasn't so bad, was it for you?
No, I learned a lot. That was very informative.
And thank you for going to the effort. It was quite refreshing to have that out on location, let's say. Jason and Paul, I'm going to ask you Paul Turley, you're quite different to Andrew's system and Jason's system in that you're a beef farmer down in Downpatrick, and you operate a very different system, but very much about maximising production from your swards as well. So Paul Turley, maybe you can give us a couple of minutes just on what your system is and how you're going to plan for the year ahead.
Yes, well, Paul Turley farming here in Downpatrick, as you say, on which is considered to be a dry farm in a dry area. A farm along with my wife Ethel and son Frank. 200 suckling cows through to beef. It's an outdoor system. It's always a bit of a challenge. We tried to sort of balance our winter keep, against the droughts in the summertime and try to level everything off as was talked about. The system is outdoor 12 months of the year. So what we would do is basically we're trying to convert grass to beef basically. And that's taken us on a journey from what was historically a grass and nitrogen based system right through well, I suppose you should say, and the beef industry doesn't really justify higher levels of fertilizers, and then whenever fertilizers come under pressure, we'll have an issue then with the factors of the cost, as against the price of beef. So we've gone from a high nitrogen system and looked for all sorts of ways to try to reduce it. So we've gone through the journey from starting about 2018 for white clovers and then red clovers. We even tried some lucerne on multi-species, and with mixed success along the way. But the living proof is that over half the farm now receives no nitrogen. So we have had a degree of success. So that's basically what we do. The cows in the wintertime, they are grazed outside on deferred grass or brassica or even stubble oats, plus bales of silage. And the store cattle are outside on a kale or a hybrid, plus the best quality silage we can make. And there's no concentrate fed to those. To keep the winter as efficient as possible, the calves are sold in August, September, so they don't enter into the second winter. So they're 18 months old roughly whenever they're sold off grass, and that reduces the burden for the winter time for us. But that's sort of how we operate. I know lime has been spoken of quite a bit, so the journey to grasses and clovers has also coincided with increasing the lime. So we try to keep our lime above 6.5 mainly for the clovers, and we reseed on a regular basis. And with the sort of the grass of choice or the reseed of choice at the moment is a couple of varieties of perennial ryegrass and red clover and white clover, and then plus or minus plantain and chicory, depending on what we think we can do. So that gives us a wee bit of an insight to the journey. It's really all about grass to beef, but it's also not grass at any cost. It's grass at a competitive price that the beef industry can justify.
Thank you, Paul. And just a quick question for you. Well, two quick questions. How often do you reseed roughly?
Well, now the brassica and the outwintering, it takes up 15% of the farm every year. So a lot of that ground is, if it's near the farm, it's reseeded every year on a short term. That would be something like an Italian ryegrass and an annual clover like crimson clover. But the main part of the farm then would be rotated. Probably the longest we'd ever have out is about 6 or 7 years, and regularly within 5. And then, as I say, the in-by land where we keep the cows for supervision at calving time is done on an annual basis.
And Andrew, you reseed frequently enough too, I think, don't you?
Yeah, I try to. It tends to be the same fields are reseeded like once every 7 years. So grazing block, intensive silage fields, but there's still plenty of my farm has never been reseeded, but I'm working around it, but it's not easy to get some of them wee awkward fields done.
Yeah, but it's interesting that both of you, are invested in reseeding every 5 to 7 years there, and obviously you see the payback in it. Jason, you're a dairy farmer then, as well as Agri-Search strategy manager. Just listening to all of this, do you want to give us your 2 pence worth on what your strategies are?
Yeah, well, absolutely. So we're a spring calving dairy herd in the Arts Peninsula. We're probably a bit of a blend of those two systems. We obviously because we're spring calving, we're relatively dry area. We try and make the most out of grass as possible. We've probably traditionally been a fairly strong fertilizer user, but we have. I'll come back onto that later. Been dabbling a bit with the red clover and the silage. I'll come back to that. But I think to reinforce what both Andrew and Paul said, it all starts with soil testing, and we would soil testing the entire farm every other year. And we do it, we do it in the winter, get the results in early January. We'll be straight on after we get that and lifting the phone to Joseph Falls and getting lime ordered in for any field that needs it up. And really, we are, as Paul said, targeting that 6.5 to start off with anyway. We want to be up there. I never want to. If I see a field so index is dropped below 6, I think I've done a pretty bad job on that. So that really is the essential. I think Andrew raised a very good point on the potash, because I think that's an easy thing to ignore. We all get the soil test and we lift the phone right away, and we'll get the lime in. The trouble is the potash. When we get that result in January, we can't really do a whole lot about it. It's best not to go too heavy on the potash in the spring, and then we tend to forget about it. But I think it's coming back and revisiting those soil analysis later in the season. And obviously we would put on like our silage like maybe something like a 23.10, but then we will top up with MOP where we need it. Any fields that's got lacking in that regard. So those are two absolute essentials. We've probably struggled with our intensive grazing systems with the white clover in the paddocks, but we have had moderate success. I would say it's not easy at all with red clover in the silage fields, and we have been able to reduce our fertilizer use a little bit because of that. So we have found that has worked on that far away kind of specialist silage ground. That has worked reasonably well. Now listen, I will lie, there are challenges with it. Weed control, I think, is going to be the biggest challenge, and in any clover, I think there's a lot more to learn. We can only hope that some of the new technologies will actually come and start to address that.
Thanks, Jason. And with regards to the K, Andrew's putting it all on at once. I think we'd have a wee bit of concern, maybe putting it all on at once. Is that something that's normal practice in your world?
I heard that too. I was warned about luxury uptake, and then I've done it loads, and I've never noticed anything. So apparently it might affect your dry cows or something, but I don't know. I seem to get away with it.
Okay, Jason. Sorry.
Yeah, listen, I've never had a problem with it against luxury uptake, and you're right. Sometimes you get these things. Now maybe more spring calving. If you've got staler cows, more autumn ones, it's probably going to be less of an issue. I have heard it can affect you. Obviously, your magnesium, but I mean, yeah, I know, Andrew. There's some of these things that we talk about that are based studies years ago, like not putting sheep on red clover and so on. And we probably need to go back and look at some of these things again.
It could be a precautionary approach. Proceed with caution, I think, is
Try it in one field and see what happens.
Yeah, Elizabeth, could I put in there now?
Yes, please.
A beef point of view, now we would be very aware of where we're putting our K and where we're grazing for from a magnesium deficiency in the suckler cows. It takes management from our point of view. We don't have very many choices. Like, they're not coming into the parlour to get a wee bit of meal with magnesium and that type of thing. So we would exercise caution about where we would put our K and when we would put it on. As the first thing. And the second thing is we do bleed K from the system quite quickly if we're taking 2 or 3 paddock cuts off. So we do have to watch it.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because you're not supplemental maybe through the parlour and things. Tell me this, Andrew, Jason, Paul, what kind of yields would you be getting then from your system with that nutrient management and reseeding, etc.?
Well, the honest answer from me is I don't know, but it's somewhere up there. It's very hard to measure your yield. I'm going to be optimistic and say I'm averaging like 12 to 13 ton across the whole farm, but I could be way off.
So we need to buy you a plate meter then for Christmas.
I will not use it.
Oh, we'll tie it to your waist or something. Jason, what do you like?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is from our experience of measuring grass is yes, you can look at an average yield, and I think we do a backward calculation every year. It's in around that 11.5 tonne of grass utilised there, hopefully growing a bit more. But what we have found is that when you actually do measure your grass, you'll find tremendous field-to-field variation, and that's really where you try and use that then to target those reseeding. Like Paul and Andrew, we try and reseed. We'll probably try and do 10%-ish every year, but the silage ground will get more done more regularly. It'll be more like the 7 years that Andrew was talking about, the grazing ground less frequently. So, but I would say on average, it's around that 10%, give or take. Some years it's more, some years it's less.
Yeah. Paul, and Paul, I'm also interested in your yield, but I'm also interested in, you've been working at multi-species from 2018 or so. You have been a lot of trial and error, so I'm also interested in how the secrets to success, the nuggets that you've found to make that successful and good yields.
Well, you've hit on a good one. Whenever we sort of went this direction, we sort of readjusted our expectations from the farm. Also, remembering it's dry and that we can burn up in the summertime. So we consider ourselves a 10.5 tonne kilograms of dry matter per hectare, and having made that decision, we're more comfortable with it. Now, last year we did 11.5 tonne, but to put some of your into perspective, some of the things you're asking about there, we would have perennial ryegrass and white clover swards that are getting zero nitrogen and haven't done since 2019. So they're 7 years in and are still doing the farm average for around that 10.5 tonne.
They get slurry, Paul. They get slurry.
We only have a small bit of slurry, and the particular fields we're talking about get a slurry application in the springtime, 2,000 gallons a acre, and that's all they've got, type of thing. So that's to be considered very successful. Our multi-species swards, we've done everything from an 18 species through to just plantain and chicory, or even monoculture of chicory. A very steep learning curve. The bottom line is that they do fade out of the swards. I feel at this stage that if I'm doing a reseed, I'll stick them in anyway. I'll take what benefit they can get. Plantain will persist longer than chicory. Chicory is nature's subsoiler, so it does a lot of good. From that point of view, and whenever it dies out, we don't lament, we just continue on with the pasture. The biggest problem with any of these clovers or multi-species, as Jason said, is weed control. And that is an Achilles heel, especially Dawkins, sort of way. Our very successful mixes, our more recent ones, is what the Sullyhead farms have done. It's a 4-4-4-2. So you have 2 perennial ryegrasses, 4 kilos each, and 4 of red clover and 2 of white clover. And we've done those now for the last 2 or 3 years, and they are bang on the money, hitting the average for the farm, and they're all on a zero nitrogen system. So we'll have, let's say, nearly over half the farm now getting zero nitrogen, and it doesn't work. Yes, some things work. Like we tried Lucerne, it just didn't work. With our 18 species, multi-species, you could probably now identify 4 or 5 species in them. So they have faded out. So it is a learning curve, and it's not everything. Your multi-species swards are lower dry matter, so at the wet parts of the year, the animals can struggle with getting enough intake, and they can be very loose. The plus side is in the dry parts of the year, they keep eating and keep performing. So I say there's pros and cons with all the system, but they're part of our system now, and they're here to stay as far as I can see.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Andrew's starting to get distracted because, to be fair, he is starting to chair a meeting in 5 or 10 minutes time. So we let Andrew go and fly his paper airplanes there. But
that was the Wi-Fi password. I tried to send it across the room, it didn't work.
Andrew, anything you want to say just before you jump off? Now, don't anybody else leave. I'm just letting Andrew go.
Yeah, no, I just think don't get too flustered with too much information. I think it's like tackle it in small chunks is my core piece of advice.
Yeah, and keep your pH
Yeah.
right, keep your nutrients right, and trial and error. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, Andrew, thank you very
Thanks
much
very
for
much.
your
Chat to you soon.
contributions tonight.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.
Cheers, Andrew.
So, folks, a couple of other wee questions there in the chat, and don't be afraid to put them in. One about protected urea. I'm happy to take that. The scientific studies would very much support the fact that there's no difference in productivity between protected urea, straight urea, CAN. And on the probability of averages, protected urea will reduce ammonia emissions from the application of nitrogen in any of those types of formulations. So it is very weather dependent. I think as Andrew rightly called it is very weather dependent, especially applying early in the spring. But on the probability of averages, protected urea is the best bet to reduce nitrogen losses and equal growth. Appreciating there's differences in cost there as well. There's maybe a good question there for you, Paul, around grass varieties. You know, how do you know what the best varieties are? You touched on it in your talk. Is there big differences between the highest and lowest perennial ryegrasses?
Yeah, in terms of yield, it can be about 10% in some cases there, in terms of if you look through the recommended lists. But again, there's other key traits. You know, it's a balancing act. Some of those higher yielding ones have lower ground cover and potentially lower persistence. So it's that balancing act as well, and looking at those other aspects. But in terms of yield, it can be up in 10% between the varieties. But again, even in grass seed mixtures, you know, you will have a range of different varieties too, which kind of help buffer that out. So they do as well. So it's just to act like an insurance policy. And so it is worth looking at in terms of some of those recommended lists. If you've supplier A and supplier B, both say having a silage mix, it is worth looking at what's in the bag and comparing that in terms of, will that suit your farm? Because again, as you know, Paul and Jason and Andrew saying, you know, a lot of these swards are being sown out for 10 years or 7 to 10 years anyway. So that's the length of time you have to live with those decisions.
Okay. Thank you, folks. I did say we wanted to wrap up within the hour. There's no more questions in the quick Q&A. Appreciating that hopefully some people haven't got caught out with the time, but if they have, there's a record there. And if anybody has questions that are watching it back on the record and have questions, please do feed them into ourselves in AFBI, and we can even send them out to Paul or Jason or Andrew and try and get you answers. We've got a short survey at the end as well that we would really appreciate you filling in and taking the time to fill in. Your feedback's important to us and to understand, you know, are these useful? You know, should we do more of them, etc. But folks, I'm really grateful to Paul Cotney, to Paul Turley, to Jason Rankin and to Andrew, who has had to move on to chair his meeting, for taking the time this evening to present on this webinar. I think some of the key messages over the 3 sets of webinars, if I can be very short and sweet on them, is, you know, we in Northern Ireland have a huge ability to grow grass. It's one of our greatest assets. Maximising the production and utilisation is the best way to reduce costs on farms. And we will have an ability to grow even more grass in the future. Potentially over the next 50 years, there's a potential to grow an extra 2 tonne of dry matter per hectare. So that's really significant for Northern Ireland as an asset. There are challenges to managing that sward, and the volatility of weather patterns will make the management of swards throughout the year even more challenging. But there are tools there to do that. And looking at your multi-species swards, I think Paul Turley there is one of our champions when it comes to trial and error with multi-species swards and working through and being resilient to keep trying and finding the solutions and sticking with them. And as you can hear there, half of his farm receives no nitrogen. So that's a huge testament to, you know, how he has managed to get to that stage. But Paul, I think it's been a journey. You know, we're in 2026 now. You're 8 years well into that journey and still learning. And I think that's where, as Andrew Wright expressed earlier, it's chinking it off bit by bit and maintaining the positivity to keep trying and keep trying things. Paul Cotney, you know, I think the really important message out of this evening from yourself and Andrew and Jason, you know, there is a return on applying nitrogen fertilizer. There is an economic optimum because of the price of fertilizer going, but actually it doesn't shift overly materially. And there's still very much a strong return in investment to apply nitrogen fertilizer where you don't have the clovers, etc. But the likes of the clovers can help manage that. So I think, folks, some really good messages coming out of this evening. Hopefully optimism that more grass can be grown. There's ways to manage that grass. Fertilizer is expensive, but there's a good return on investment, and even that reseeding piece, has good payback, and doing it every 5 to 7 and certainly every, at least 10 years definitely has the payback. So, folks, thank you very much for your time and attention. Thanks to the presenters, and any questions once you watch it back, let us know. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.